Always wear the MK. No match.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here, all of you in person here at Constitution Hill, and all of our participants online. Thank you for joining us for this event. I am Cheryl Frank. I work for the Institute for Security Studies. I'm a project manager, and I work for the Anti-Corruption and Technical Assistance Project. And I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the ISS and our partners, Cut to Black Communications, and we'll speak a little bit more about that as we go along. So we've invited you here to Constitutional Hill, this auspicious venue, quite purposefully. And we're really here to talk about how we harness the considerable power in this tiny little bookie that some of us still carry around, and have been encouraged to carry around a little bit more recently, and how we harness the power here in order to confront what my colleague Colette continues to call this wicked problem of corruption that we're all facing. This is the fourth in a series of events that is being hosted by the ISS called the Driving Justice series. And here we'd like to be speaking to our new representatives in Parliament and in government about this wicked problem and the particular contribution that the ISS wants to make in response to this problem. So in our discussions today, what we hope to do is to deepen our conversations about how corruption happens and why it happens. And these are complex issues. And we believe that this is an essential prerequisite to actually charting forward a pathway that is practical in nature, but that also is relevant to our context and our history. So we want to make sure that we're bringing all of those things together. So very briefly, our program for today is that we are going to be launching 2 new research products that you will see in the room in front of you, and you will be able to access online on our website. And my colleague Colette Ashton, who has been working tirelessly on this for over a year, maybe longer, to present some of the key issues that are discussed in our research projects. Our panel will then reflect on the issues that emerge, and then we would like to introduce you to a new web tool that we've been developing, and speak to some of the issues that we raise in our web tool. So this event and all our work, in fact, would not be possible without the support of several donors and partners. And in particular, for our project work relating to anti-corruption, we would very much like to thank the United Kingdom Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office in South Africa, and thank you for being here, and GIZ for the support. The ISS is also grateful for the support that we get from the members of the ISS Partnership Forum, and I will name them: the Hans Seidel Foundation, the European Union, the Open Society Foundations, and the governments of Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And then I'd also like to introduce and thank our panelists for being here. Firoz Cachalia, Chairperson of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. Yasmin Bacus, Yasmin, thank you, Commissioner in the Public Service Commission. Andrea Johnson, Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, Investigating Director from the National Prosecuting Authority. And we would like to also introduce you, obviously, to our moderator for the day, Ferial Haffajee. You need no introduction, Ferial, but one of our country's most respected journalists and currently associate editor at the Daily Maverick. So with that, I want to hand over to you, Ferial, we will take you through our program then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and thank you for all that you quietly do to get us to this point. So good morning, everybody. I want to start with a small story from the outside looking in. So a friend called me this week. He had accompanied the Minister Parkstow to the US to get AGOA back on track. And he was telling me that our country was so lauded there at those meetings, because we don't often laud our own country. And I said to him, why? He said, well, a liberation movement conceded defeat in an election, and it did so gracefully. As somebody who sat at the election center watching those results coming in and see the ANC's face, the people at their benches dropping as it got to 40%, was it going to go lower? But then immediately afterwards, the key message is we hear what people are saying. We concede that we've lost this election. Then he told me that they were also really impressed that we'd struck a power sharing agreement in just 12 days. Pretty amazing. And it's sticking till now, Roman cabinet notwithstanding, and a couple of other things. Also, that the election was demonstrably free and fair, and the institution of the IEC stood the test of the bully who threatened it on the night before those results came out. So many reasons I felt, take a look at us from the outside looking in. I, however, as an anti-corruption journalist, I feel like we tend to speak as if we are past the era of state capture, and that sordid short history of grand corruption is indeed past us. But I think that all of us have to concede that with the news this week that our Justice Minister, Ms. Thembi Simelane, was granted a soft loan from a VBS broker when she was the mayor of Polokwane, it raises a hornet's nest of issues that I hope we'll get to discussing today. The smaller picture in the bigger picture, of course, is a community like you, people committed to fighting corruption every day and in every way. It's a threat I've always felt to the fundaments of our constitution. And today we meet to build hopefully strategy and perhaps a little tactics even. So first up is Colette Ashton, research consultant to the Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the ISS. I've been reading your two papers and I find them truly shape-shifting, and how you challenge us to look very differently at what you call a wicked problem. So very welcome to take us through those.
Hello. We're presenting a different perspective on corruption in South Africa. It might initially take some of you a little bit by surprise. It is based on research done by professors at the International Anti-Corruption Academy, where I did a master's degree. And this led me to the ISS to continue research into corruption in South Africa. Any details of what I'm going to say you can find in the two ISS research papers on your chairs. I am a lawyer, but the research is multidisciplinary, and that's a key factor in building an effective anti-corruption approach. I'm going to frame what I say today in terms of 4 basic questions. Number 1, why is it so difficult to prosecute corruption? Number 2, why is it even more difficult in developing countries? Thirdly, what are the unique challenges that we face in South Africa? And what can we do about it? What lessons can South Africa learn from the rest of Africa? Firstly, why is it so hard to prosecute corruption? There are many factors that combine to make this so, in a vicious circle, and I'm going to touch on a few of them. The legal system evolved over hundreds of years to deal with crimes like murder and theft, where there's evidence, there's a victim, and there's people willing to testify. None of these things apply to corruption, which is in fact committed by secretive networks of people who are serious about it remaining a secret. And it's enabled by huge teams of professionals, accountants, and lawyers who develop complex schemes to hide the proceeds of crime and to hide the real beneficiaries behind financial secrecy rules. Also, these days, it's a globalized crime, and legal systems are confined to the borders of a country. It has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very difficult burden to meet for a prosecutor, especially with complex economic crimes, where it's very difficult sometimes to tell the difference between an invoice that is evidence of corruption and a normal invoice. The legal system is backward-looking. It's retrospective. It looks at retribution for past crimes. It doesn't look at how to prevent further harm. Also, a lot of corruption is not even a crime. I'm thinking of systemic corruption in organizations where the criminal acts of corruption are facilitated by people who they might be bullying, they might look the other way, but the legal system doesn't have any answers for that type of conduct. And most importantly, everywhere in the world, there's an inherent conflict of interests in prosecuting corruption. The most powerful members of society are sometimes the beneficiaries of corruption and responsible for enforcing anti-corruption rules. And I'm not saying, Andrea, that anyone is telling you what to do, but I'm saying that the Department of Justice, for instance, has got control over the budget of the NPA, and that's the kind of thing that needs to change. Okay, that was the first question. Moving on to the second question. Why is it even more difficult to prosecute corruption in developing countries? Now, in the so-called global north or the west, democratic institutions evolved over time in step with the economic development of the country. And what we see in developing countries is that often we've got cut and paste models of those institutions, but without that economic development over time. In developing countries, we've got informal economies alongside formal economies. Now, those informal economies are often as large as or larger than the formal economy, and they operate according to a different set of rules that are unwritten rules and that are enforced, sometimes using violence. So, sometimes there are powerful networks that benefit from that informal economy, which includes corruption. And these powerful networks of people don't need the rule of law to do business. In fact, they don't like the rule of law because it gets in their way. And so they exercise direct and indirect power to weaken anti-corruption enforcement. Does this sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
So the point is, in developing countries, we can't assume that the rule of law always applies. And a lot of anti-corruption programs are based on the assumption that transparency will automatically result in accountability, assuming that the rule of law, once people find out about corruption, that the rule of law will allocate consequences for that corruption in the form of accountability. But in developing countries, as we've seen, transparency does not always amount to accountability because we can't assume that the rule of law principle always applies. So this is a very particular context for anti-corruption enforcement. And we need to innovate, not relying completely on the Western orthodoxy of what we call the good governance paradigm. Transparency leads to accountability. And we need to find our own ways to address this problem. And this is such an important point. We wanted to underscore it by featuring two international experts. We'll start with Dr. Pallavi Roy, who's an economist at SOAS at the University College of London. And then our very own Professor Shope Williams, who's a renowned international expert in procurement law at the University of Stellenbosch.
The good governance paradigm actually identifies a set of governance capabilities, but these capabilities are hand-me-downs, if you wish, from the set of higher income countries that we now recognize as OECD countries, as countries who have achieved a very high level of capitalist development and who we call high income countries, as I said, the OECD countries. And it is based on particular theoretical models which come from liberal economics, which had its source in the Western countries and actually is much more applicable in these kinds of Western economies. So what are we looking for? You know, the cornerstone of the good governance paradigm is that markets have to be efficient, property rights. You know, all of us own private properties. We are mostly living in societies where the state owns properties, but also we as private citizens and individuals are allowed to own property, and those rights have to be protected. It also encompasses media freedom, it encompasses rule of law, it encompasses voice and accountability, all of which, if you think about it, you know, very clearly and very seriously, these are outcomes, these are where we want to be. Most of us aren't living in these kind of contexts. How do we get there? We want a rule of law, but we can't have a rule of law to get to a rule of law. How do I get to a position? What is the set of policy packages that will get me to rule of law? And that is why the good governance paradigm is not very effective for understanding development or why we have corruption and how to deal with corruption in most developing countries.
If our anti-corruption framework is overwhelmingly based on legal frameworks, then we're expecting that there's going to be reporting. Of course, we know the problems with reporting. There's been so much about amending our whistleblowing legislation, but in a high crime society, we see the effects that whistleblowing has on whistleblowers, right? In a high crime society, in a society that where there's an abundance of firearms, you know, then people get killed. So in a high crime society, thinking that you will enforce your anti-corruption by people coming forward to report, when people have seen what has happened to previous reporters, then, you know, again, it's, you know, I think, I don't need to say more, it's problematic because a lot of them were historically developed from work done in the US and done by the OECD. They favor a lot of international cooperation, a lot of extradition, and African countries were not plugged into that network, right? So for instance, if you see, I mean, we know the debacle that happened with the Gupta extraditions, which never were. And right now in the media, there's a report of a man who's being extradited to the UK for committing sexual abuses in the UK when he was a teacher there. So the UK is able to get their criminals back to the UK, but we are not able to get our criminals back here. So, you know, I don't know what's where that tension is in the system, but it's not working for us the way we want it to. A lot of the fundamental assumptions that we take from Western societies that we then integrate into our system, those assumptions are just not there. So it's like a house of cards in a way, because all the legs that you expect this, you know, the top of this table to sit on are not there. So the table is not a table, it's on the floor. And, you know, we're seeing the outcomes of that.
We need to look harder. Once we do the looking, you can find sectors where there already are solutions bubbling under or potential solutions that we can work at. But we need to start doing the hard work. We tend not to do the hard work because it sounds easy. Let's have more accountability. and more transparency, and then the legislature will pass, and let's say an anti-corruption commission will be formed. But that's the easier thing, legislation. What is it that we can do in terms of design? And I think that's where the hard work lies. But once we are able to get to that level of hard work, the solutions are forthcoming.
So why is it even more difficult to prosecute corruption in South Africa? What are our unique challenges? We are the most economically unequal country in the world. There are enormous barriers to entry to the formal economy, and fixing that problem is a big part of the long-term solution. Another factor is that our democratic institutions are new and struggling to establish themselves. Also, the high levels of violence and organized crime create difficult conditions in which to prosecute corruption. Another factor is that we've got the blessing and the curse of rich natural resources that people want to exploit. And we have a highly developed banking system, supposedly ideal for laundering money, so I hear. So what we have is actually the perfect storm. And here's some good news about corruption in South Africa. If we benchmark our anti-corruption efforts against those of similar states across the world, we can see we're not doing too badly. We're certainly not doing as badly as we think we are. The Zondo Commission is unique globally for the amount of transparency that it created about corruption. 1.7 million pages of information. People from other developing countries can't believe that such a thing is possible, to have that amount of information about corruption in the public domain. Another thing, our law enforcement institutions did their very best to put a former president behind bars for corruption. Not many countries have managed to do this successfully. And I can't think of any other young democracy that's even tried to do it. Research shows that all countries go through some type and some level of corruption on the way to economic growth. But what can we do about it? This is my fourth question for anyone who's counting. Countries that deal with corruption so that it does not become too economically destructive over time end up with economic growth. China is an example. Another example is South Korea, that at one point was a transition society, economically unequal. Cartel capitalism took over in the early days, and it's been transformed by effective anti-corruption efforts into a strong economy with a stable democracy. Conversely, Pakistan, where corruption was not dealt with effectively, and we've seen decline, economic stagnation, and political instability. So we have the high road and the low road to choose from. South Africa can become a regional leader in dealing with corruption. So far, Africa has been a laboratory for anti-corruption reforms designed by experts from the West, international institutions, but not suited to local conditions. For example, Hong Kong once had a very successful anti-corruption agency that was well suited to a small, homogeneous, wealthy trading state, which we are not. Anti-corruption agencies based on this model do not have a track record of success in Africa. research shows that what we need are small scale, homegrown, sector by sector, one institution at a time reforms, not one top-down silver bullet solution. Africa is also a laboratory for anti-corruption programs that have worked. I'm thinking of the Kenyan Anti-Corruption Commission, which has a good reputation for anti-corruption enforcement. It focuses hugely on prevention. It also does investigation, and as a top priority, it does asset recovery using any means possible, including through negotiated settlements. One example, a prosecutor from the Kenyan Anti-Corruption Agency, Advocate Philip Kagusia, on his own has obtained more unexplained wealth orders than the whole of the Serious Fraud Office in Britain. Some of Africa's most successful anti-corruption reform projects come from Nigeria. Dr. Pallavi Roy, the economist we met earlier, she's helped local experts in Nigeria to design a project focusing on the energy sector, designed specifically to differentiate between greed corruption on the one hand and need corruption on the other. Greed corruption is very difficult to remedy, and so quite wisely, this project doesn't even try to do that. Instead, it focuses on what it can fix. It focuses on small business owners who are bribing local officials for illegal electricity connections. They're doing it simply so that their businesses can survive. That's need corruption. So are they doing it to survive, or are they doing it to buy an expensive car? That's the research question. This project redesigned the economic incentives that those small businesses operate in to reward rule-following behavior. My absolute favorite anti-corruption reform project in the world is one run by a very well-respected man that we at the ISS have come to know as Uncle Soji, a man who describes himself very humbly as just an angry engineer. Uncle Soji's project in Lagos Harbour in Nigeria has reduced corruption in that port by 96%. I'm not saying it was easy. It's taken him 10 years, a lot of hard work, perseverance, relationship building, and also courage. But he shows us what is possible.
The Nigerian miracle. The first miracle was that Nigerian public officials agreed to work with the private sector, and they also agreed to work with civil society in collective action. That was the first miracle, because it has been very difficult to get that level of cooperation on an issue, and then especially on an issue that is considered to be as sensitive as the issue of corruption in Nigeria. The private sector found itself in a corner. The UK Bribery Act had come into force. This is now 2011, 2012. And the proprietors of a lot of the shipping companies thought, we're in trouble if we don't do something because of the new offense in that UK Bribery Act, which says failure to prevent bribery is an offense under the Act. Under the UK Bribery Act, and even under UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, and even the OECD or the FCPA, many of these facilitation payments and other things have now become outlawed. So therefore, there was high risk for the private sector if they didn't do something. So with a lot of contrition, they approached the Nigerian government to say, we know that we've been part of the problem right from the beginning, but we'd like to be part of the solution. Can we work together towards these ends? In the early days, it took as many as 150 signatures for a vessel to come into Nigeria's waters, do its business, and leave again. And of course, with that number of touch points, you could not avoid corruption. So the first thing to do was to identify standard operating procedures and remove the overlaps between the operations of different agencies. The second miracle was that the government was prepared to get 14 agencies in the room and encourage them to work together to reduce corruption. The third miracle was that they actually did work together. They identified a lot of the areas of risk and their own standard operating procedures. It was a great start, a great place to start. So the private sector was then able to ask, what then happens if these operating procedures are not followed? And this is when a grievance reporting mechanism was agreed. But where we now hit a snag was when we then asked that, well, can we have access to this data of the reports that we've been making so that we can track what has been done with what case and so on. And that's when we hit a brick wall that, well, it's now secret. Anything you give to government now becomes secret and the file is marked secret. So when we couldn't get any data and we couldn't follow up on any cases during implementation, then we had to build what we called a help desk. And we thought about it, that the process of coming into Nigeria's waters and leaving is finite. When you arrive, when you birth, you do your business, and then you depart. It's easy to break those into processes. So we did, and we were able to convince the ship masters that, well, if they were too scared to report issues to the government, they could report to the help desk. But here's a help desk number, and from the time they come into Nigeria's waters, they're already testing the number, testing the WhatsApp number as well to see whether there would be a person to respond to them when they came into port. And that way, we were able to, in real time, go with the masters through their paces. And as soon as they hit a snag, we knew they would tell us through the help desk. The help desk will escalate to its partner, primary partner in government, which is the Nigeria Shippers Council. The Shippers Council will escalate to immigrations if it's an immigrations issue, or to customs, whoever it was, and they would stay with the issue until it was resolved. Then we got to a stage where the masters were able to also share the gangway log with the help desk. So we knew which officials of what agencies were on board at what time. And so when there was an issue, we found that with the Shippers Council, the intervention could even be immediate, where there would be a phone call to the vessel and questioning to the official to see about some questionable demands that were being made and so on. And that way, a lot of things got quelled before they became bigger issues.
If they can do it, then so can we. In our report, we make some recommendations. Among others, we propose incremental improvements to both the structure and the organizational culture of law enforcement agencies. We propose that resources are urgently provided for corruption prevention. It's shocking that the only dedicated corruption prevention unit in government responsible for national, provincial, and local government is staffed by 9 people. We recommend that government and civil society partner with the private sector in sectoral collective action projects like Lagos Harbour. We suggest that there are legal and policy reforms to incentivize companies to improve their own corruption prevention and detection systems. Let me summarize. Corruption's complex, it's hard to prosecute, and it's a normal part of a country's economic growth. The obvious answers like punishment don't always work so well. We need solutions and innovations that are appropriate to our unique conditions, and we have an opportunity to start now. Amazing.
Thank you very much, Colette. Thank you so much for really, I thought some provocative, but also provoking questions for our discussion this morning. Excited to be on a panel with people who are right at the cold face of things. So Andrea, when I heard about Uncle Soji, I think you are our Auntie Andrea. And thank you for all your work, because I know it often comes at a big cost. So now that you have, your independence has been enshrined into law, every time I read, you're getting firepower, people, also budgets. How does that independence sit on you? Is it going to make your work easier?
So perhaps I should start off because, I actually did read some of the papers that were sent to me. Thanks, Cheryl. So I just need to emphasize that my being independent means I don't get to walk this walk alone. It really means, and Ferial, you know, I've preached this almost always when I've had an opportunity, that my independence becomes a true reflection of what I do through public-private partnerships and collaboration. I need society. I need the people that I serve to not just believe, but to stop doing the wrong they're doing so that I can do what I do much easier. Of course, independence in the ID means I now have the powers, but I would like independence for the NPA because that's my mother body. We don't have independence of budget because the DG is our accounting officer. And it's so funny, when I was thinking about it this morning, I remembered that way back in 2007, when Advocate Vusi Pikoli was the national director, he and the then DG of Justice, Menzi Simelane, were constantly at loggerheads about what an accounting officer to the NPA, not sitting in the NPA, meant for the NPA. Fast forward 2024, we have the exact same conundrum, the same debates. So the independence for the ID, I'm truly grateful because we now have powers. It means I can recruit. It means, by the way, we've been doing the work even before we became truly independent, but we would like independence for the NPA, because if the NPA is independent, it also helps our recruitment. It means we have a say over who comes into our space. If I may just, it became so important in 2018 when we did the interviews for the national director. Was the first time. It most certainly cannot be the last. It changed the ball game because it said society got to see who's the madam or the mister that gets to sit in that chair. But having that open process meant it was power wielded by the people, not power wielded by government officials putting someone in a chair. And now we've just got to take that systematically forward for that independence.
Thank you very much. If I can stay with you for a moment, and I hope it's not putting you on the spot because you don't seem to mind that. This week, I think all of us are reeling from the news about our Justice Minister having received some of the money from a VBS broker when she was the Polokwane mayor. Fast forward, that does hold up certain challenges about independence.
So I'm going to be, am I supposed to be diplomatic?
No.
Okay, I'm just supposed to be honest. So the honesty is, and this is how we've always done the work we've done. The national director tells it to us all the time. Not that she needed to, because a lot of us, through the history of what happened with the NPA and prosecutions in the main, have always adopted what is the evidence? Does it implicate someone? Is that implication criminal? If that be the case, then Johnson and her team have got to do the work. And so that must be true to every other agency or institution that either oversees, investigates, and or prosecutes corruption. The VBS matter is with the Hawks, the DPCI, and with the Specialized Commercial Crimes Unit of the NPA. I do believe in all of my engagements with them, those principles that apply to me as the ID and IDAC apply to them as well. And so if the facts make out a criminal case, they should not shy away from doing what is right. Because when all is said and done, it cannot be about, let us look for a case because it is the minister of. Is there a criminal implication in your conduct? We're going to prosecute you, and then we take your name out of it. We take your criminal conduct and the facts that support that.
Thank you very much for answering. Prof. Firoz Cachalia, lovely to have you on the panel. As the chairperson of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, all of us are waiting with great eagerness to see the recommendations that you make to the president and to the public. I believe that that report has gone to the presidency. Is that so? And could you share with us some of the cornerstone recommendations?
Thanks, Ferial. I'm really delighted to be here because it gives me the opportunity to talk about this report and its recommendations. And I will comment on Colette's presentation. Colette was intimately involved in helping us draft the report, conceptualizing the report, and we've had excellent support from the ISS. Continue to work with the ISS in the next phase of our work. So let me just make an initial observation about current thinking about the way the current discourse in the country is being framed, anti-corruption discourse is being framed. What is right about the current emphasis on criminal law enforcement, on the work that Andrea is doing and the MPA is doing? What is right about it is that we have to improve investigation and prosecution of criminal corruption. It's really essential in the fight against corruption because that's also going to help us win support from the public who want to see results. And the Zondo Commission has done amazing work, focused on, if you like, a particular category of bad actors in the state system. But what about what Colette's report shows is that the time is right for a conceptual shift in the way we think about corruption, in the way we think about anti-corruption reform. So you're correct. We have produced a midterm report. It follows on 4 advisory opinions, which included the focus on funding of political parties, procurement, and so forth. And the midterm report has been received by the presidency. I received about 2 weeks ago an acknowledgement of the receipt of the report and considerable support from the tone and content of the letter. The report, I've now presented the report to the Forum of Director Generals The next step will be to present the report to the Criminal Justice Cluster. Andrea was present when I presented the report to the forum she sits in. And we're then going to have to see, I'm in discussions with DG Baleni about, who's also given us tremendous support, by the way, to at what point we release the report in the form possibly of a discussion document or a green paper for public engagement on one track, and on the other track, we want to get to the point where there is a cabinet decision. And the process I've described is that pathway. So what's in the report? We have recommended the establishment of a new anti-corruption agency called the Office of Public Integrity. And it's largely informed by the conceptual framework that you've heard elaborated this morning by Colette. So firstly, we've rethought what we mean by corruption. Our proposal is specifically aimed at addressing the problem of systemic corruption. Systemic corruption is a much broader concept than the way we've understood state capture. It potentially covers any corrupt institution throughout the country. And you pointed out in your opening remarks, it's in fact quite problematic at this point to think about corruption as limited to the state capture inquiry. For those who are interested in this concept of systemic corruption, which we've incorporated into our report, read the affidavit of the CEO of BBS, where he describes precisely in one very interesting paragraph the modus operandi that Colette described, where you have an institution that is corrupted by a set of actors who in fact have a governance framework, a way of rewarding and punishing individual participants to ensure coherence, who operate in secret and so forth. VBS is in fact an interesting case of systemic corruption, because it's clear that and we should think about that institution, not so much as having been captured, but as being systemically corrupt. So we have framed our proposals in the light of that concept. Second, and if it follows, is the focus on prevention. What we've identified in the current institutional matrix is a huge gap on the prevention side. So while Andrea is going to be doing very important work, and Shamila dealing with those after the fact who've been identified as criminal suspects, we've got to do the important work of identifying corruption proactively at an early stage. Let me take the example, which I'm very interested in, of Tembisa Hospital. If you have an agency that can go into that hospital once it has some kind of triggering evidence or so, conduct systemic audits, for instance, into their procurement systems, propose binding corrective action, you can start to root out corruption in a hospital, in a port, in a local authority. So the second is this idea of prevention. The third way in which we're proposing that the current thinking, dominant thinking in a way about the fight against corruption be that our thinking evolves, is to understand the importance in our country of having a multi-agency approach. So the dominant thinking, if you look at the proposals that are being floated, is that what we need is in fact a magic bullet, one huge anti-corruption agency, collapse the MPA into this new agency to focus to incorporate powers of investigation, prosecution, even policing powers, and to focus on criminal law enforcement after the fact. It leaves out of our anti-corruption efforts, behavior change, public education, public involvement, prevention, and so forth and so forth. So we need to fill that gap, and we need to fill that gap in a realistic, feasible way as part of our current institutional matrix. So our proposals don't interfere with the powers of the DPCI. That's beginning to do really important work. We're building on what the SIU is currently achieving, and we're seeking to strengthen the work that Andrea and Shamila are doing on the prosecution side. My final point would be this. There's no magic bullet. So we should be thinking about anti-corruption reform as a long-term project of institutional reform that is comprehensive, that is all government, all society, and that is rooted in our own historical context as well as our current context. So I'm in full agreement that economic inclusion is part of the fight against corruption. But our current thinking prevents us from approaching corruption in a way that is specific to our context, that is comprehensive. And success of our anti-corruption efforts is going to depend on this paradigm shift, if you like.
Thank you very much for the insights into 4 touch points of a very important report that's going to come out. Commissioner Yasmin Bacus, very welcome. The Public Service Commission doing vital work, and I was wondering if you could share some what Colette calls bright spots of wins that have been achieved. But I also know you wanted to hear what the Commission was going to come out with. How does it sound to you?
Thanks, Ferial, and thank you to the Institute for Security Studies. I actually want to start off really, Ferial, differently. I want to pick up where Colette left off. And when she rounded up with her last sentence, it reminded me of a project I started with Manchester City Police and Scotland Yard when we wrote the first book on community policing in KwaZulu-Natal. And it started off by saying, with development comes crime. With development comes crime. And as you continue to develop, there are more opportunities for crime. And of course, there's always a lot of innovation in the criminal networks. So we need to understand corruption in that context. We have a lot of development going on. Fast forward 30 years later, we have obviously the perils of what we are facing in terms of corruption. Then I want to hook into the Nigerian example, which is what I brought to share with you today, to say one of the most important things we need to focus on as a country is e-government services and digitalization. Because as you digitalize, you eliminate too much human contact and you reduce opportunities for bribery, physical bribery. It won't go away completely, and that's why I use the word reduce. And so if you digitalize, you can use a lot of artificial intelligence and data and analytics. When you use data analytics, what you're able to do is then to work out where the corruption is coming endemically in the system, red flag it and deal with it. Now, the corporate world deals with that beautifully. They digitalize various levels of authority. You don't have to have 150 signatures like the Nigerian example of the bureaucracy. You limit them, you cut out the risk areas, you digitalize, and then it red flags. Of course, not to say that the corporate world is a fine example, because from my own experience, having spoken to experts who deal with fraud and corruption in the corporate world, they have something which really takes them under the cover called brand protection. There's a lot of it happening out there, and we don't speak of it. We only want to speak of government. But brand protection means if I'm the CEO of a great conglomerate company and I've siphoned billions, They will quietly hide it under the carpet because it'll affect shareholding and the stock market, listing, et cetera, and so they quietly shift the problem away, pay it out, deal with it, and it doesn't get to the prosecuting authorities. So let's appreciate that as well. It's another syndrome in our country. And of course, it happens in churches, NGOs, wherever else it is. And we have that endemic problem. So digitalization is something I think we can really work on. The former Minister of Home Affairs started this. He started what is called digital portals for application of services or application of IDs, etc. And I think that is an important project as well, because when you start to do these things, you can pick up anomalies, fake things that are coming up, etc. So I would really focus a lot on e-government services there. SARS works beautifully because it has a deviation from CETA and it can design its own solutions. And some of us that are sitting with the challenges that we have within the system know that this kind of deviation and ability to go to market and design systems that will eliminate and prevent corruption is what we really need. And that's an important aspect. And I'm very passionate about how we should revisit and reposition CETA so that it works for us. To have e-government services, which eventually will cut out and reduce a lot of the corruption. I think the other important thing is to look at the professionalization framework, which is now obviously the Public Service Commission. So are you all right? Okay. All right. I think my presentation knocked him down. So Ferial, coming back to that, you know, the professionalization framework is what I'm hinging my hopes on, because it was a great project between the NSG, DPME, DPSA, Public Service Commission, where we're looking at expert recruitment, great models for entry into it, to make your career in government look like you're a patriot. It's an honor to serve the state, and you should serve it well in terms of upholding the constitutional values and principles, the little book, you know, and particular hinging on your financial responsibility in Section 207. So I think, you know, the professionalization framework with its 5 pillars, seeing what we bring into government and upskilling those who are already there, you know, by doing an audit of skills, upskilling, getting people to do what they should be doing, and then driving integrity and ethical leadership. And it should not always be the poor public servant that should face this. We need to start this right at the top. We need to have a leadership conversation around corruption. And we need leadership to come out more often and say, we support this. We have an integrity framework. We support this. This is our charter. We live by it. We lead by example. And I think for me, that's very important. I want to raise another controversial point, and I'm hinging on what Professor Cachalia said here. And as much as we say we want to do prevention, there is a lot of prevention that is happening by the day by thousands of public servants, and that's called graft blocking. Now, Professor Tuliba Dinsela at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Lithuania recently in June raised this terminology.
Graft blocking.
Graft blocking. I consider myself one of those graft blockers myself, because I blocked a 38 million contract in the KZN Department of Agriculture. As an acting accounting officer, I was given 15 files and a 38 million rand invoice to sign by a protected service provider who was linked to leadership and you know, other people. It went to court, and it took 10 years of my life, 2004 to 2024, and finally got thrown out of the Bloemfontein Court of Appeal, and we saved 38 million. And I don't think it was something extraordinary that I did. I was an accounting officer, and that's what I should have been doing. But there are thousands of public servants who are graft blocking, who are traumatized, who are sitting at their desks, traumatized by the levels of approvals and authorities, who have nowhere to go to. So when we speak about prevention model, it is happening, but it's how we elevate it, how we bring it to the fore, how we find, allow a space for them to find expression, to say, look, I'm being pressured and I'm not coping with this. I'm being undermined. I'm not getting promotions because I'm trying to block these things. And I think these are the real conversations we must have. And we don't get to, you know, just talking about.
I think the graft blocking deserves a round of applause there. Hey, that's 34 million rand. But a whole new category of people, whistleblowers and graft blockers.
Whistleblowers come after the fact, and of course, it's when they do encounter it. And of course, we've got to give them absolute credit for it. But there are those who sit there and block the state from losing millions as well. And we need to give recognition to that and find how we find a space to give them to raise that safely.
Absolutely.
And of course, if you have a leader who should be executing the responsibilities as an executing authority in the Public Service Act, then that space is open. And we should ask ourselves, why don't public servants find that space open? Right?
Thank you.
So I'm moving to whistleblowing now, Andrea, and I think that's very important for us. You know, Ferial, whistleblowing is very important, but it must also be incentivized. As part of the learning journey that we went through the International Anti-Corruption Conference, we looked at the Belgrade model. Now, Eastern European countries are pressured by the European Convention to meet, I think it's Convention 19 or 20, and establish anti-corruption agencies. And when they do so, we have a model in Belgrade where prosecutors are trained to deal with corruption specifically. Law enforcement officers in the policing are trained to deal with this. Judges are trained to deal with it, and they have a specialized anti-corruption court. These people have to be registered, trained, and certified. And that is the dedication of their country. Better still, they work beautifully with the NGOs who then do the whistleblower protection. They are allowed two options as a whistleblower: to go public on it or to report it anonymously. And the NGO gives a lot of protection and does even write up the manuals and train the prosecutors on it. So we need to have this intersectoral collaboration. And I think the NACAC is, through its strategy, suggesting that we bring all these sectors together and work together in harmony to create the competency of fighting corruption. So whistleblowing and the use of social media platforms. I think we're using it to speak about what has already happened and not preventing corruption. I came across through my research a platform that was set up in India. I paid a bribe. Let's Google it and check on it. Do we have something like that? How serious are we about corruption in this country? How many anti-corruption adverts have you seen on television? Have you heard on radio? And yet we have huge communications bills, and we don't really invest in that. Same with our IT bills. Our strat plan starts off to saying, we want to be a 4IR organization, etc. Drill down to the budget and the IT directorate, 4 people who are just network operators with something less than 500, 400,000. So we need to be serious. We need to have the capacity. Who raised, I don't know if it was yourself, Colette, that raised the fact that, yes, I think in your paper, you were saying we need to create this competency. But then when we create this competency of the new National Anti-Corruption Agency or the envisaged OPI, are we going to give it the necessary capacity, the skills, and the resources? Because if we are serious about it, we're going to pump a lot of resources and capacity and skill into it so that we get the necessary outcome. And of course, it's not an easy journey. And like Professor Cachalia said, it's not going to be a magic bullet or a magic wand, but it has to start somewhere. And the seriousness starts with establishing an agency that's given the necessary capacity. And of course, we also speak as a Public Service Commission to independence. We want, as the Public Service Commission, to be able to oversee the driving of the professionalization framework. But we also need—
Can I ask you a question here?
Yes.
So at the moment, I'm sitting on a story where the CFO of the Johannesburg water entity has claimed to be a chartered accountant. He's anything but. He's a cadre deployed by a party in the coalition to this vital job. Joburg has thousands of water cuts every day. How did that happen? You know, we're supposed to have a professional framework at every level of government. Isn't it all just wordage?
You know, this is something that's also being driven in the framework, in that we not only recruit people who are proper professionals, but we also look at what's existing in there and we validate. We know that.
But nobody validates. I can
Well-
point you to hundreds of examples.
Look, we also, as a Public Service Commission, get regular grievances and complaints about people who were recruited but don't have the necessary skills, and we have to investigate and then come and then our recommendations don't get taken. So we have the Public Service Commission bill that's out, and we're hoping for a lot of support, because once we give the directive and we say this person must now be eliminated from the system or dealt with differently, then I think that will really work for us. So I think also to have regulatory bodies, Ferial, is going to be very important, because the framework speaks to that. So you have the people pass the CIMA exams and they get the Chartered Accountant Agency, or nurses are registered with the Nursing Council, but what about other professionals? And so if you create a body, regulatory bodies for professionals who then obviously apply their trade with government, and then you are able to hold them to the norms and standards of that regulatory body, that will work so much better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll come back to more questions. Colette, so you've heard a lot there. I do want to touch on your papers directing us to social norms and systems that don't come enough into our public discourse. You say that often these work with something called the machine. You look at the role of bullying and promotions as negative and positives to encourage the machine to keep it running. Could you describe that for us a little bit?
Yes, I was very privileged when I was writing my master's thesis to do my research at the National Prosecuting Authority, who with complete openness and transparency allowed me to interview staff members. And what I found there, in the words of one interviewee, obviously all my interviewees are anonymous, is the existence of something that he called the machine. And he said, when I saw a good employee sign off on a bad decision, I knew the machine had gotten to him. Now, I've heard this term from other government institutions, and it has different names in different institutions. I believe at the SABC, it was called the beast. Now, I was able to do research into how it works. We heard during the years of people finding out about state capture for the first time about parallel systems of governance within institutions. And I wanted to find out exactly how they worked. And what I found very helpful was research done by scholars in Eastern Europe, where this phenomenon has also been researched in depth. And they originated the concept of what we call social norms. That's a technical term, but basically it means the unwritten rules that govern organizations, how people expect others to behave towards them. And those expectations, I suppose like peer pressure, are very powerful in determining human behavior. And they're more powerful than the official rules of the institution, like the code of conduct, the regulations, or even that wonderful chapter in the Constitution that the Public Service Commission upholds, chapter 10. About the values that civil servants should work with. Now, the machine operated by exerting pressures in the forms of rewards and punishments, incentives and disincentives. So those unwritten rules are held in place by incentives and disincentives. Incentives, the most powerful example is, who do you promote from within that organization? Who's getting promoted? On what basis are they being promoted? What values do they embody? And we found that the basis of promotion in the past had often been not merit and ethics.
So is that what happened? And then what happened to the graft blockers on the other hand?
I suppose in terms of the value system that was in place, if the reward was promotion, the punishment could often be something as simple as bullying, right? Subtle bullying, or overt bullying is incredibly powerful in organizational culture to convince people not to speak out, even when their own natural values would prompt them to speak out. So rewards and punishments, promotion and bullying, holding in place this organizational culture that convinces people to not even think about being a graft blocker. So a lot of work has been done by the National Prosecuting Authority in changing those organizational cultures and in establishing a new Office of Ethics and Accountability, which is in the process of being set up in order to work with organizational culture.
Thank you very much. Andrea, you worked when the machine was operating. Could you share that with us? But can I add on a question about how are the prosecutions of the big cases going? When Shamila Batoy addressed,
She has to ask.
when the NDPP addressed Chief Justice Zondo when he hung up his green robe so beautifully last week, she acknowledged that the baton had been passed to the NPA, but she said to him, you know, you presented this fabulous report to us, but that your burden of evidence is much lower than ours. And I'm wondering if you're beginning to breach that, if you now have systems, people, money, etc., to get going on those.
Let's start with the second question. 'Cause
Okay,
that's
okay.
easy.
The easy one, right?
The easy one. So, look, while I have gift of the gab, not even I can talk myself out of the mammoth task we are faced with. So the commission, as everybody knows, and as we've preached, really operated quite differently. Colette did half my work by pointing out how very high and how difficult the burden of proof is in criminal matters. The courts are not ready. So we do have money, we're getting our systems, and we're getting our recruitment going. So, of course, we were only signed into law on the 26th, 27th of May, and last week was the final bit. It's the bit that allows me to recruit. So, to your question, I currently have 12 criminal investigators seconded from the DPCI. I have 4 that have now been brought into the fold, and I have about 5 seconded from SEPS. So, Bob's your uncle. What do you want me to do very quickly? But we are able to identify the priority cases. We have been able to look at them. Everybody says, oh, what went wrong with, and let's go through that, Ferial, because we shouldn't hide. We didn't do anything wrong in the Gupta extradition. We asked the UAE, tell us what we did wrong, because we did it all right. 2 years later, we're still waiting. Lots of diplomatic follow-ups, a lot of legal follow-ups. We don't have an answer. We also gave them the option. If you want us to reinstitute the application, we're happy to do it if you answer one question. Are you going to charge the Guptas for money laundering in the UAE because you have concurrent jurisdiction? And depending on your answer, it works out how we reformulate our papers. Take the Nolani matter. Whilst I can't discuss the facts, something that you said, and Yasmin, the digitization of data, I just wish that could happen because that would have
yesterday.
saved us. Let's do last week. Okay, but where it would have helped us, Ferial, is that became the problem. Over a long period of time, we've had systemic corruption, both within government and in the private sector. Smart people, please don't undermine them. Do you think that they thought fast forward, okay, 2022, there's going to be this little missy called Andrea Johnson, and she's going to come to investigate us. Oh, let me keep my stuff under the bed and wait for her. All the papers will be in a box. It's not there. And that is the missing link, is the papers within government departments that would have pointed us in the right direction, allowed us to overcome that burden of proof, is not there. It's not there. So can I tell you about, well, we didn't, I don't know if we had a machine. Well, maybe that's what some of them call them. I think a lot of them call them the beast. A lot of us call them that lot because they always only met after hours. And I was a victim of the beast. In 2015, I saw that there were 2 individuals brought into the unit where I was. One of the PAs asked me for a copy of my performance contract. And I simply asked, but why? Because these people don't work here. They work in different provinces and our contracts are different. I was told they're coming there. When I asked why, I wasn't told. And a week later, I actually remarked to the acting head of the component, I said, but why are they coming here? We're fine on our own. And I said it in jest. I think they decided I should have a pleasant Christmas, maybe something of a new year. And when I got back in January, I was called in out of a conference in the middle of the day, and I was a guest at the conference. I was told I couldn't see him the next day. I get to the office, I say, yes, says you will pack your bags and you will leave and go back to the DPP office. And I said, why? Says, this remark you made. I said, excuse me, that was a joke, but can I speak to the national director because he told you what to do? Picks up the phone, the national director, of course, doesn't want me in his office or in his ear. And I was told that—
Are you
thank
allowed to say
pack your
which one?
bags. Before Shamila Batu.
Okay.
Okay. So $20 if you can guess the name. And so what happened,
Only 30 bucks.
Ferial, is, I was so angry. But what I do remember, which is something we talk about in the independence, it's part of that personal entity sphere. If you have a reputation for doing right, if you have a proven track record and you know your people and your customers, you're always able to go back. I was able to call the DPP. I said to him, I'll be back in a week. They cleaned up an office for me. The person who put me out said, can I help you? I told him there's 2 alphabets, a F and a O, and I can manage on my own. And I did exactly that. And from then, I promised myself that I couldn't be quiet. So this is where I am.
Yeah.
I am not arrogant about anything. I am not flippant about it. I am optimistically cautious that I have an incredibly difficult job. But by God, it's a job I'm going to do. Machine, beast, or that lot. It's neither here nor there.
Good for you. I have a big one coming up with a former minister, but we'll chat about that later. So I'm going to take questions now. You can get them ready, but I've got a lot online, so let's whip through them quickly. Obviously, Prof, first on to you as the chairperson of NACAC, and this is from Pops Rampasad of Active Citizens Movement. The council is tasked with an all-of-society approach to fighting corruption. What mechanisms are in place, are you about to put in place to ensure accountability to citizens and civil society organizations? They wrote to you in March, on March the 13th, 2024, regarding whistleblower advisories sent to the president. And then what's the current status of the whistleblower bill? I'm not sure if anybody knows that. So I must share a little story just to tell you how big an issue this is. There's somebody who's told us about a 2 billion rand slush fund in Gauteng. Gauteng is the center of many things. The person wants to make a protected disclosure. The only place where I trust to send them to is the whistleblower house at the moment. So if you could answer some of those questions for us, please. First, the all of society response.
Well, the new proposed agency is informed by an all society approach. The idea is that the new agency should be able, for instance, to have public inquiries, engage in public education projects and so forth. And so obviously our response to that challenge is to propose, which is what we were asked to do, advise the president on setting up an institution that could implement an all society, all government approach. On whistleblowing, I mean, I think that's, a critical area of policy reform. Tandeka, Kubule, and Becky was our headed up our work stream on whistleblowing. She's worked with the Department of Justice. In that area, we think the Department of Justice has produced excellent policy proposals that now require legislative changes. So she worked very closely with the Department of Justice. We also made a recommendation to the president that in the interim, we recommended that that he appoint a judge to deal with such matters until new institutional arrangements have been put in place. That was not, we haven't received a response to that proposal. We discussed it with Chief Justice Zondo. Don't think he thought that it was a workable proposal. So I think we're in a period of reform around whistleblowing. We've made proposals to, for consideration by government.
Thank you very much. Got one from Barbara Holtman. Maybe you could take this, Yasmin. In Joburg, the widespread belief that corruption is rife in the city leads to increasing numbers of people saying that the only way to get anything done or signed or to stay out of jail is to pay a bribe. Every time that happens, we move closer to chaos that causes people to go. Change is urgent. The perception of corruption, the actual corruption, and the steady flow of people who give up on legitimate processes is very real.
Yeah, could I just, I
Yes.
forgot something. In our recommendations on the OPI, we have proposed that one of its functions should include whistleblower protection. Should be part of the new agency.
Part of the OPI, huh?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Do you want to have a go at Barbara's question about the perceptions?
I think she put it quite beautifully. The audit results for the local government sphere was raised yesterday. And, it couldn't be more damning than that. We were regressing. And what Barbara is saying is feeding exactly into that. And I think one of the challenges we have is that we're not focusing enough on the local government sphere. And of course, because it has its own different policies and it's not aligned to national provincial policy in many respects, that we have people vacillating and maneuvering around this, creating a lot of risk. So I think for us as the Public Service Commission, we're looking forward to our Public Service Commission bill being passed, which then gives us the ability to extend our powers over local government sphere and look at issues over there and the public entities as well. But I think we definitely need to, as a country, focus a lot on the local government sphere. Insofar as service providers and the whole issue of bribery is concerned, we have to, I can't say overhaul, but when Terence November was there, he did a great job of dealing with our procurement system, etc. We know the integrated financial system has been sitting on ice forever. We need to work on that side, and as I said, digitalization, such that we eliminate too much human contact, because small businesses can't compete against the monopolies and oligopolies of the major service providers and those networks that exist there, who are organized, and like Colette said, who have their lawyers and have everybody, all their specialists, in that whole network. So when the small businesses compete, they feel the need to then unfortunately take the bribery route to be able to get a slice of the pie. And it's not because they want it corrupt, they just want to obviously stimulate the local economy and keep that, obviously part of the segment of the market going. So I think it's going to be very important to revisit our procurement system, get CFOs onto a regulatory body that also, deals with their conduct and their behavior and the norms and standards of that financial part of the industry. And of course, hoping that the PSC gets this bill passed so that we can start to investigate and then produce the reports that say, this is what it looks like. And this is where we can then take our recommendations forward.
Thank you very much. So Coletta, may I ask for a short answer to a very big question? A big part of your recommendations is in support of deferred prosecution agreements, especially for big business. So these have been struck with SAP, with McKinsey, with others as well. I have my differences with them because I think that rich people are allowed to buy justice, and then you see that big machine, that spin machine kicking in, that we've never been charged with anything, we're no longer on trial. They continue to get huge contracts in our system. Could you tell us why you support them as an option?
A short answer.
A little short. We just I have quite a few questions.
Well, I think let's start by looking at the stats. The NPA annual report over the past 6 or 7 years leads us to the conclusion that the NPA is competent in prosecuting corruption at a certain level. You know, the bribery of a traffic official and so on. They do get convictions for that. But actually in the NPA's annual report of, I think, 2021, in their own words, they said, we need to admit that there is at the moment impunity for serious corruption. We need to look at it in that context, because it's not like we have an ideal situation where right now the rich are facing justice. They are not. And that undermines the rule of law. So we have been searching for realistic alternatives. We found non-trial resolutions. Deferred prosecution agreements are one type of non-trial resolutions. They're used by many countries all over the world. And research by the OECD shows that they are, in fact, a driver of increased anti-corruption enforcement. And they are designed primarily to create a vehicle for information about corruption to be handed over from this secretive network, these corporates, to law enforcement officials in order for individuals to be prosecuted, high-level individuals to be prosecuted. It's information that it is impossible for law enforcement to get without help from the inside. And from the inside in this case is the legal person of the company that can't go to jail anyway. In a non-trial resolution, the company escapes a finding of guilt, but it has to admit responsibility for a set of facts, and it has to pay back the money. Ideally, that amount should be comparable to what it would pay in a penalty, for example, in a plea bargain. Another thing that companies need to undertake is to improve their own anti-corruption prevention and detection systems. So Ferial, it's not a perfect system of justice, but it's the best that law enforcement all over the world have found that they can do in a situation where multinationals are richer and more powerful than many governments.
Thank you for that.
Ferial,
Yes,
I'd like to say
please.
something
Yes,
about
please. Huh?
Okay. So this is a matter, this proposal for non-trial resolutions needs debate. I am sufficiently pragmatic to recognize the problem, which is the mismatch between our capacity to investigate and prosecute, and on the other, the aggregations of wealth and power that that make it difficult to achieve results. But it raises a question about the way we think about corruption. Think about state capture. Focus was entirely on state officials, as it should be. But the evidence in the Zondo Commission showed that a large number of the actors were private companies. In fact, all of the major consultancies, I recommend highly reading Mazzucato's work on this question. All the major international consultancies were involved. They were the primary financial beneficiaries. This project of systemic corruption really was enabled and facilitated by lawyers, accountants, and so forth. A lot of the evidence before the Zondo Commission showed that corruption is also concerned with the interface between the private sector and the public sector. Some of the domestic banks were identified. There were issues around improper lobbying, around policy capture, the sort of NASPERS, ETV. I don't want to mention names so much, right? I'm not targeting any particular institution, but this is an issue. I think that this idea, and here I maybe have respectfully a kind of disagreement, this idea of framing corruption as a developing society problem has the merit of focusing on context, but a lot of our corruption has got to do with globalization, got to do with financialization, and so forth. So I am intuitively at this point unhappy with a conceptualization of corruption as one focused entirely on the public sector without recognizing that corruption in many jurisdictions increasingly takes the form of improper influence of private power over public power. And it needs to be tackled. It might be that, you know, the best way to deal with this is through deferred prosecutions. But if we were to propose, for instance, that grand corruption by entrenched political power should be dealt with in that way, there'd be an outcry. So I think there's a large...
There'd be a huge outcry. I mean, just a small story, you know, the head of McKinsey who struck the deals which really kneecapped Eskom, he just went on to start a very viable startup in the UK. Complete impunity for his actions here. And he was the guy at the center for it. So I see the pragmatism, but also the problem. If there are questions from the audience, yes, I'll take about 3. Florencia, there, anybody else? Thank you.
Am I first?
Yes.
I'm John Clark. I'm a social worker that works with whistleblowers and providing psychosocial support and spiritual counseling and helping them through the ordeal so that they don't end up what happens so much with whistleblowers. Question I want to ask, as I've grappling with this problem now for 4 years since Mandy Wiener's book, and not seemingly getting any kind of purchase on some way that we can change that systemic condition that Colette so beautifully explains, to kind of try and see how we can get a countervailing process going. And the biggest obstacle I presently kind of experience, and I don't know how many of you are lawyers here.
Many of them.
Is the legal profession. I am the beneficiary of a defamation slap suit, which people might well know about, the Mineral Sands Project, where 6 of us were sued for defamation by an Australian mining company. I'm just mentioning that because we got a constitutional court judgment in 2022, which outlawed slap suits. As I stand with you today, I thought that would be the end of them. And I thought I could now widen the space for civil society to engage and to actually speak truth to power without fear of that particular form of retaliation. As I stand with you today, I've got 2 more defamation suits against me because of supporting clients who have themselves been got defamation slap suits. So, and I'm saying, well, why am I saying the legal profession? Because I know in the UK, the equivalent of our legal practice council has basically held the feet to the fire of all attorneys that actually indulge in that vexatious abuse of legal process, in that process of that ulterior motive with an improper motive.
What's the question?
Trying to do it. So the question is, how many of you lawyers present are going to go to your next elections and make sure that we have a legal practice council that does that?
Thank you very much. Florencia, I'm going to take all the questions and then we'll wrap because we have some minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ferial. My name is Florencia Belvedere and I work in the National Prosecuting Authority. I just wanted to go back to something Andrea talked about, which is this aspect of independence. And I see many faces in the room that have been working on this issue for a very long time. And the independence of the MPA and what we mean by that. I think we have been very fortunate that over the past 5 years at the MPA, we have had the space to be able to make decisions to prosecute without any undue interference that might have characterized the MPA during the state capture years. So we've got that degree of political independence. And we've got a leadership that has integrity and ethics and would not be swayed by undue reasons, let's put it that way. What we have been now focusing on, which is one of the key strategic priorities of the MPA, as Andrea was saying, is the aspect of financial and operational independence of the MPA, so that the MPA can work much more efficiently and effectively. Because a lot of what we experience is a lot of red tape that also, President Ramaphosa has talked about how we need to get rid of red tape. So the one aspect that we have been pushing for is to address those aspects. And they've been raised in a number of fronts. I mean, during the Zondo Commission, that was a key thing. That was one of the key recommendations, that we must give the MPA that independence to also enhance its political independence. Civil society was very vocal when the MPA amendment bill was going through Parliament and saying for the IDAC to work, to be able to be effective in fighting, in prosecuting highly complex corruption matters, must have that independence. And we also made some commitments to Parliament about introducing legislative amendments by January 2025. So I wanted to just say that, yes, part of also we're looking at the how we appoint the leadership of the MPA, and certainly President Ramaphosa has started with a process, but we need to cement it much more. But it's also other aspects of that operational financial independence that we really need to strengthen.
Thanks.
So just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. Kugan, and then Nikki, and then we'll go to you didn't, Nikki?
Hi, I'm Nikki Prince. I'm former head of research from the State Capture Commission. It was just on the Integrity Commission suggestion. One of my concerns about that is creating yet another institution in government that's looking at fighting systemic corruption, because some of the activities that you mentioned struck me as things that could be falling under other institutions. So when you talk about whistleblowing, I'm thinking, well, isn't that something that the NPA, for example, would have a lot to say about? They would know, what do whistleblowers need? What is the best way to incentivize them? Or if you want to strengthen procurement systems, isn't that something that belongs to the Treasury, to their new procurement office? Or if it's how people are hired, something to do with how the public service is structured, shouldn't we empower the Public Service Commission to do more? Because especially it strikes me as a stage where we want to strengthen all our institutions. We've got limited resources, and aren't we in danger of diluting things?
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, so shall we take a round to wrap? Because we're heading quite close to time, and then you can just answer the questions. You do want to say something?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Hi, my name is Kugan Pillay, the incoming head of stakeholder and relations at Corruption Watch. I want to reflect on the presentations that were made earlier, and there was talk about good governance and what it means and all of that. Are we not going into a phase of rhetoric, semantics? I mean, more recently, we hear about talk of consequence management. And really speaking, it's a euphemism for accountability. Now, you might remember 5 years ago, we had a young girl, teenager, confronting the world leaders at the UN about the impact of climate change and future generations. 5 years later, at COP28 last year, you might remember King Charles making a comment at the end of the conference. He's talking to the world's leaders and he says, colleagues, aren't we failing the world here? We've been hearing resolutions after resolutions, but we don't see what's missing is a action plan, a time frame, and accountability. So we have the resources, we have the capability. I think what's different now, and talking about the theory of change, is we have a government of national unity. Because people have been talking about the political will before the election failing us. Now we have, how do we move from rhetoric to action? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's take that round of questions. You can pick up any questions that Andrea.
So for me, more than the question has been the comments about how we resolve and fight corruption. I think we must just be alive to. There's no one fix. it really is a multifaceted approach. The corporate ADRM, and by the way, in the NPA, there's no non-trial resolutions because we're a prosecuting authority, so you prosecute. But what we have to remember is orange overalls, I've said before, we're going to change them to pink because people are fixated about orange overalls being the cure-all in the fight against corruption. It isn't. What is the effect of corruption? It has robbed our people, the ones I serve, of their dignity, of jobs, of homes, etc. So part of the decision and consideration in an ADRM is not big business getting away with the money. We want the money to restore the dignity, and at the very least, that money was in our government coffers. It comes back into the government coffers to at least bring back housing, education, and jobs. It is a true public policy consideration. So when the NPA looks at it, and I can only speak for the NPA and ID, that is first and foremost. There are other avenues. So the company bears the brunt, but everybody else, executives, directors, shareholders, half of the cost, they get prosecuted. So let's just look at corruption and the fight against corruption somewhat differently, which would take into consideration the whistleblowers, good corporate governance, independence, financial, political, and otherwise. And across the board, if we're not going to hold hands, then all of these various things are exactly what Coogan says. They're just rhetoric and pretty English.
Thank you very much for that. Please, Prof.
Thanks. So we have maybe not enough orange overalls. We have quite a lot of red overalls and now pink overalls. Soon we'll have another political party. So I'm not in favor of pink overalls.
It's girl power and it's women's mind.
No. I think the issues that are being raised about the independence of the MPA have the support of our council. And I think a lot of public attention needs to be focused on that conversation. Nikki, your questions are extremely important. I mean that, although it's of some interest, it comes from you because the Zondo Commission proposed a new anti-corruption procurement agency. It proposed that there should be a permanent commission of inquiry modeled on the Zondo format, which we've tried to accommodate in some way, but didn't fully agree with. So the Zondo Commission recognized, based on the evidence that they received, that there was a need for strengthening existing institutions, but also proposing new ones. We have looked at this multi-agency system and identified coordination, prevention. Let's wait for the report to be released for that conversation to take place. But we've taken your perspective into account, if you like, in thinking about what we mean by a new agency. So we haven't simply, looked at best practice models elsewhere and said, well, we need a new anti-corruption agency. We've looked at our resources. We've looked at the current institutional framework on the ground. And we've looked at our resource constraints. And essentially, I suppose one way to think about the OPR is that it's the SIU 2.0. I don't want to think about it that way because it has a range of functions and capabilities in our conceptualization, which the SIU doesn't currently have, but it builds on its existing capabilities. The SIU has an infrastructure across the country. It's got offices, a footprint across the country. It has capable officials who have the relevant skills, say, for instance, when it comes to asset forfeiture. They've got some investigative capabilities that we've seen. So we are talking about establishing a new institution because, for instance, we think it should enjoy the protections of a Chapter 9 institution, and it should have additional capabilities and powers. So we've made a pragmatic and carefully tailored case for the establishment of a new institution by taking your insights into account. So it's a new institution that we think can work and should augment the infrastructure of anti-corruption, which is already in place. But an important and good point that you're raising in thinking about how we should be approaching institutional reform.
Thank you very much. Any final thoughts, and what's the one thing that would make you happy in a year's time?
Digitization.
Digitization, okay.
But let me respond to Florencia there. And I think this was raised also by Colette in her paper, and I think she brought a lot of factors together. And that's the issue of how strong are the institutions that have been set up by our democracy. And of course, we have to reach this stage, because any new law, any new reform that's put in has to have a period of time in which you test it and then you review it and you strengthen up. And I think we're in that period, and there's a lot of will, there's political will out there. There's a different mind shift change as well, and that's going to really help us. And we as the Public Service Commission suffered the same thing as the NPA, where we're not fully independent, and we have the DPSA telling us what to do, and obviously running our budgets, etc. So if we get into that space where we have that independence, through the various legislations that are now being put in place, and we're going through the reform and review phase, I think it's going to work beautifully. And I see the OPI as being that umbrella structure, organization, and I'm really hoping it has the independence like Chapter 9 institutions, and it coordinates all of us. And within that arm, there's all parts of society. There's the proactive side and the reactive side. And I'm placing my bets on that one, Prof.
Thank you very much. Colette, final thoughts, and also could you have a stab at John's question about how do you prevent slap suits, defamation suits, harming the actions of whistleblowers and of civil society?
Yes, on that note, I've been thinking about anti-corruption heroes. I've got one on my left, a graft blocker. The person who originated the term graft blocker is our greatest anti-corruption hero, Thuli Madonsela. I'm thinking about Judge Raymond Zondo. I'm thinking about the head of our IDAC sitting here on the podium. I'm thinking about John himself, who took a case all the way to the Constitutional Court and defended that slap suit to change the law. We talk a lot these days about leadership and the importance of leadership, and it's becoming a bit of a catchphrase. But I want to say, as a researcher, in one sentence, research shows that to change a system, to shift a system, the most effective way to do this is to change the vision of that system. And that is what our homegrown anti-corruption heroes are doing. They are changing the vision and giving us something different to believe in. And that is the most powerful thing that they can do.
Thank you. A perfect note to close on. Thank you very much to a lovely panel. We have one more item, a beautiful tool that's going to make all of us anti-corruption heroes. So welcome, Faisal Cook, and we can leave the stage.
So most of you will know me from Strictly Come Dancing, where I failed miserably. But the truth is, I was a crime reporter in 1994, and at the public broadcast at a very interesting time. And between Yusuf Abramji and I, we probably contributed about 30% of the people leaving the country in the 1990s. So I think in penance for my role in stoking panic and fear, I did a lot of work with the Institute for Security Studies and the NPA. And I think what we're about to show you is a project that started out as an idea, acknowledging that behavior change has a particular style. Media journalism isn't not necessarily interested in the same model. So while we were searching for this orange overalls and this obsession with the orange overalls, we knew that we needed to find a way to feed society with information, and that information wouldn't necessarily come from state institutions. We know many of our institutions have had quite an adversarial relationship with the media. So we found that we needed to create a repository of information to keep people up to date with the movement in the corruption space. And we couldn't rely entirely on the South African media to do it. We know that the media was always in a challenging environment. We've seen in the last 10 years, many of the institutions failing. So what we wanted to do was to create a way in which you could have an independent, trusted platform that would feed information to society at large who were crying out for these pieces of really good information that was coming out, but doesn't necessarily always feature in Daily Maverick. What started out as a conversation over 2 years, largely self-funded and promoted, we found a partner in the ISS and has now become accountability tracker, which in some way reflects the kind of partnership we ask for. We're a small business. We started this on our own. We found support from the ISS to make it real. But I think it begins to address some of the challenges around information and behavior change. And we're hoping that it will inspire you. And we're hoping to be able to, at some point, hand this tracker over to the citizens of the country so that they can take ownership of it. So please ignore my voice. I apologize for this thing. It's coming up now.
Addressing corruption is crucial to strengthening South Africa's future. Welcome to the Accountability Tracker. The Accountability Tracker deepens knowledge about corruption in South Africa, collaborates with policymakers, practitioners, and the public to offer tailored anti-corruption responses rooted in lessons from local and global experience. ACT represents the word accountability, and the word itself encourages action, recommending that users utilize the agency they have in their respective spheres of influence to take relevant action. Our key outputs are premised on the importance of collaboration, both with various stakeholders and the public, to exchange knowledge, best practices, and support. Our case studies provide accessible summaries of key corruption cases with analysis of the nature and dynamics of corruption and the lessons for prevention and early intervention. The ISS offers insight on key issues of interest in each case, notes the crimes committed, and suggests the opportunities there might have been for prevention. Case selection is based on what we know is top of mind for the public, but where case complexity can make the details quite difficult to follow. Each case study uses a layered infographic diagram that takes the user on a journey, featuring allegedly implicated role players and considering their current status of accountability. This narrative explains the nature of corrupt activities relating to high-profile cases and is produced in the public interest. Arrows direct the user, making it easier to understand how some of these cases progressed over time, also showing how different players, businesses, entities, or individuals got involved at different stages. Each case study features a story summary before breaking down each element of the various aspects of the case down in more detail, providing a view of both companies involved and the key players' alleged involvement. Details for the cases in the Zondo Commission are provided up to 2023. We include more up-to-date cases in the recent cases update section. The ISS analysis section provides our key insight into these cases and considers the dynamics of corruption, as well as identifying patterns from a research perspective and specifically focusing on how these types of corruption can be avoided in the future by foregrounding lessons from prevention and early intervention. Finally, we look at the impact on the public. Our activities feature publications which profile new research and policy recommendations on corruption and anti-corruption efforts, and also includes upcoming event information and additional multimedia resource. Finally, our resource hub is a repository for all anti-corruption legislation, conventions, and anti-corruption organizations and bodies. Terms and conditions make up a glossary that provides ease of access and reference for any clarity that may require it. This is only the beginning. The accountability tracker will in the near future focus on state-owned entities that will be updated via an AI tracking tool that we will develop with university graduates at a national hackathon. From there, we also hope to monitor local government compliance with MFMA obligations. We want to hear what you think. Talk to us on the site and share your feedback, and subscribe to our updates at accountabilitytracker.org.
Yes, of course. That's great. And I'm pleased that you like all of that. A lot of it is us still dreaming and building and developing. So I want to close this program by just thanking you all for being here, thanking our panelists for being here. Ferial, thank you for where are you looking after this process for us. You know, the ISS is so grateful to be part of this community of investigative journalists and practitioners and policymakers and prosecutors that have worked together, you know, and we're jointly doing this project. So we really want to hear from you about your needs and how the tracker can help you and support you. You've seen that we're also part of a burgeoning network of international people who are very, very generously contributing to our debates and our discussions. And we are very lucky to have had Uncle Soji online there and people like Pallavi Roy from SOAS and Chope Williams, Stellenbosch University. That community is growing. A lot of people do this. We work on a shoestring of a budget. And so a lot of people do this out of their own willingness to support these processes and make them happen. So, you know, we're very grateful to those people for keeping with the party. Nikki, thank you for coming on board very late and helping us get the Zondo facts right. And by the way, we're very worried about defamation. So we're watching every P and Q on that site. But thank you everybody for that. So lastly, and not leastly, all of this has happened with, it's been a year and a half, especially of that tracker of Faisal and Courtney's team, Kruger van Deventer, who is our saint of a website designer, who's been helping us, and then the ISS team of Lizette and Kathy and Lorato and a whole range of other people helping us do this. But the core of this has been the research reports, and thank you very much to Colette for sticking with this process also for a year and a half to try and get all those ideas together in one place and in a coherent way. And I'd like to thank all of them for that. So if we can give them all a round of applause. And then lastly is lunch. So we can offer you lunch outside in the women's jail, in the atrium of the women's jail, a historical place. So if you'll all join us for lunch out today, Kathy will lead you